I want to say a couple of things before I start. The first is to all of you sitting here. Can I thank you for your patience in queuing to get in today? You will understand, I know, why, for the particular security arrangements that we have to have in place for the Prime Minister, and for the same reason, when we finish at any break, would you please remain, all of you, in your seats so that the Prime Minister can leave first. That again is for security reasons, and I know none of you would want to prejudice that in any way. Secondly, it's for you, Prime Minister. Can I just express the gratitude of the inquiry for someone who is probably one of the busiest, if not the busiest, people in the country, with a packed diary, making space at our request to come to this inquiry to give evidence. Much appreciated. I should add, in respect of all the ministers and the Leader of the House who we are hearing from this week, that all of them have come freely at the request of the inquiry in order to facilitate this particular and useful week. Prime Minister, let me explain to you the arrangements. You're talking obviously to a packed hall, but probably the number of people who are listening will be in four figures, both here, below in an overflow room, and more particularly online. To your left, you have lawyers. Those in front of you are participants in the inquiry who have a particular interest in what you will have to say. Apart from those at the back who have a rather different interest, they are from the press. So that's your audience. In a moment or two, Ms. Richards will ask you the questions, but first I'll invite Mary to ask you to take the oath. Mary.
Please state your full name.
Rishi, Sunak.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by the Gita
I swear by the Gita
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Prime Minister, you say in your witness statement that as is the usual process for managing policy decisions, this work is being led by other ministers, and I will be cited in relation to the scope of the scheme and intended response at the appropriate stage when they have a set of formal recommendations to make. My understanding is at the time you made your witness statement, your knowledge of the issues was therefore limited for the reasons you've described, but that since being asked to give oral evidence, you've asked your officials to brief you on a number of points, and you have some notes with you as an aide-memoire. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, I don't think you need an introduction. You're Prime Minister, and you have been in that post since the 25th of October 2022. Prior to that, is this correct? You were Chief Secretary to the Treasury between the 24th of July 2019 and the 13th of February 2020.
Yes, that is correct.
And you were Chancellor of the Exchequer from the 13th of February 2020 until the 5th of July 2022.
Yes, that is correct.
And you were first elected to Parliament in May 2015.
Yes.
Now, you've made a statement to the inquiry. We don't need it on screen at the moment. The reference for lawyers is WITN 77120001, and it's available to all who would like to see it on the inquiry website. Prime Minister, I'm going to start by looking at two documents, two letters that were sent by the then Paymaster General, addressed to you, although you may not actually have seen them, in 2020. So if we could please have Lawrence on screen, EIBS 40706. And we can see the date of the letter is the 13th of July 2020. It's from the Right Honourable Penny Mordaunt MP, who was then Paymaster General, addressed to you, Dear Rishi, and she explained the capacity in which she's writing, sponsoring Minister of the Inquiry, to update on progress and commitments the government has made. And then if we just look at the heading, under the heading Funding the Inquiry, you'll see from the letter she's raising 3 matters: funding the inquiry, financial support, and then when we go over the page, in due course, compensation. I just want to flag up, if I may, and ask you about what's said under the heading Funding the Inquiry. There's reference to public commitment to support the completion of the inquiry's work. And then Ms Mordaunt said this work remains urgent for many victims. Justice delayed is justice denied, as the fallout from this tragedy continues to claim lives. Now, just pausing there, Ms Mordaunt told us, as the letter indicates, that she was aware that people were continuing to die. And it's obviously the case that it follows from this letter that your officials would also have been so aware. Do you know whether that's something you were aware of at the time, that this wasn't just a matter of an historical injustice, but that people were continuing to die and to suffer, as indeed they do to the current day?
Well, just before I address that specifically, if I might start by saying that I believe what has happened has been an appalling scandal. I think thousands of people, obviously many in the room today and others that the chair referred to who are watching, have suffered for decades. And they've suffered a layer of injustices, in fact. And it hasn't just affected those people who have been directly impacted and affected, it's affected their families and friends and carers as well. So it goes far beyond those who are directly impacted. And as you just said, this is not just about historic wrongs. People are suffering and being impacted today. And I believe every 4 days, someone tragically loses their life as a result of what has happened in the past. And as I've been reading the testimonies of those involved, affected and infected, it's been a very moving experience for me, and I commend everyone who's shared their testimonies for their bravery. It can't have been an easy thing to do, but has enabled this important work to take place, and indeed I'm pleased to be able to be here to contribute to that important work. With regard to the letter, as is entirely normal, it would have been dealt with and was dealt with by officials. It's not a letter that I saw personally at the time, but again, that is not unusual given the volume of correspondence that ministers, particularly senior ministers like the Chancellor, receive. It'd be entirely normal that those letters would be in the first instance dealt with and triaged by officials. And in this particular instance, my understanding is that there was communication between the officials at the Treasury and indeed officials at the Cabinet Office who worked for Penny Mordaunt at the time.
But although the letter didn't come to your attention for the reasons that you've explained, and which echo what we've heard from other ministers in terms of the filter process in relation to correspondence, do you know whether you had any awareness or whether there was any broader awareness within the Treasury or within government at the time about the point that Ms Mordaunt was making here, that people were continuing to die? Was that something you can recall being aware of at that time?
Not something that was brought specifically to my attention that I was involved of. There were 3 topics raised in that letter, which over the course of the following months were all dealt with substantively.
We'll pick up on what happens over the course of the following months. Just looking then still at the highlighted passage on the screen. Justice delayed is justice denied. More broadly, do you understand and accept the point that Ms Mordaunt was making there, justice delayed being justice denied, and how delay itself can compound injustice in this context, the infected blood context?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, this appalling scandal has gone on for decades. I mean, people have been let down for decades by successive governments. People raised concerns. They were battered away and told nothing was wrong, nothing to see here, that wasn't right. People thought that they were being helped when in fact, as it turned out, they were being harmed. People asked for an inquiry, that was rejected before it was finally accepted. So I think over a succession of not just years, but decades, justice has been denied to people. They haven't received the recognition that they need and deserve, and that's why I'm so pleased that the inquiry was established, that it's continuing its important work and hopefully will conclude soon, and the government is committed and I'm committed to acting as swiftly as possible.
And we'll come back to the question of government action. If we just go over the page to what Ms Mordaunt said about compensation, so you'll see the heading compensation for victims. She says in the second paragraph, second line, I believe it to be inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. The costs are likely to be high, and then there's reference to the Irish model. I believe we should begin preparing for this now before the inquiry reports. My officials are working with DHSC colleagues to consider approaches to compensation. Any decision on compensation will require careful consideration. And then she says, experience of other inquiries suggests that early action could save the government significant legal costs, as well as provide victims with compensation as soon as possible. Now, in relation to that sentence I've just read, you'll see Ms Mordaunt there identifying two benefits to early action. The first, a potential financial benefit to the government, and then the second, the provision of compensation to victims as soon as possible. I will come back later to this phrase, as soon as possible, but what Ms Mordaunt explained and accepted in her evidence was there she was looking at the question of what was the morally right and just thing to do. Would you accept that?
Well, obviously, Penny could best answer questions about what she was trying to get across in the letter. As far as I can see reading it now, there were three topics that she raised of substance. The first was continued funding for the inquiry, which has been delivered on with over £125 million to date being spent on the inquiry to make sure it could do this important work. The second was resolving an issue about parity of treatment between those impacted living in different parts of the United Kingdom. And again, that was resolved in spring of 2021 whilst I was Chancellor, with the provision of an extra £175 million of funding to do so. And the third topic was around compensation, where since that letter was written, interim compensation payments have been made to around 4,500 people, and as people are familiar, £100,000 each. There's a figure mentioned in here. Obviously, to date, over £500 million of those payments have been made. And as the letter itself says, any decision on compensation will require careful consideration. And there's further detail about how Penny envisaged that might happen. Obviously, lots of things have evolved since that letter, not least we've had Robert Falstart, the chair's interim report, but also Robert Francis's report, which have a variety of suggestions which are slightly different to those mentioned in this letter. But again, they've been delivered on. And I think Penny Mordaunt herself said the three topics that she raised, all of which she was able to progress.
Yes, and obviously my questions are going to focus on the issue of progress in relation to compensation. Would you accept, and this is a question really about the position of the government as opposed to your own, because you didn't see the letter at the time, as you've explained. But would you agree that this letter indicates that the government was on notice back in 2020 of the likelihood, Ms Mordaunt uses a stronger word, inevitability, of the government needing to pay compensation?
Yes, what I'd say is, obviously, in my role, it was not something that I was directly involved in, because these costs were not, or those forecasts had not been crystallised at that point. The inquiry had been established, it was doing its work, there had been no interim reports from the inquiry, and it wasn't my direct departmental responsibility in the way that it was Penny's, as she would be the responsible minister for it. It wasn't something that, as I said, I was directly involved in at the time, and I think probably because the work was still ongoing and it hadn't reached a point where those decisions on compensation had yet to be made, or any advice or recommendations from the inquiry or others had at that point not been made either.
Let's just look at Ms Mordaunt's follow-up letter, which is EIBS 40705. So this is the 21st of September 2020, so a couple of months later. If we just go to the bottom of the page in relation to compensation for victims, you'll see Ms Mordaunt repeating what she'd said about the inevitability of the government needing to provide substantial compensation. And then she says, and we've got the adverb firmly added now, I firmly believe that we should begin preparing for this now before the inquiry reports. And then if we go over the page, she suggests she'd like to meet with you or the Chief Secretary, and then says, I cannot stress enough the urgency of taking long overdue action on financial support and compensation. And then there's a handwritten addition from her suggesting there's ideas about a solution, and she'd been trying for some time to secure a meeting with you. This letter was not, I think, regarded in the same way as the previous letter. The first letter, your statement tells us, was regarded as being for information. This letter, your statement suggests, received a holding response. Is that right?
Yes, so to the best of my knowledge, this letter was dealt with by officials. It wasn't brought to my attention, and there was communication between, again, Cabinet Office officials and Treasury officials on the substance of it. Again, I am not directly aware of exactly what happened. My understanding is there was not a meeting that took place, but officials were in touch, and I'm not sure the reasons why that didn't happen. But from what I can tell and what records show is work was going on between the two different departments on resolving the issue raised in that letter above on the first page about the parity of treatment, which was a substantive and immediate issue at that moment. And again, that was resolved some months later. I think Penny's letter refers to the spending review. It was resolved reasonably soon thereafter, as I said, with a provision of about £175 million to resolve those disparities that had existed between people in different parts of the United Kingdom.
Would you accept...
And again, I just say it would be normal for matters of public spending to be dealt with by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. That's entirely normal. So the Chancellor has a very broad remit. Chief Secretary to the Treasury's primary responsibility is public spending. I used to, as you indicated in your opening, had that job myself, and it would be entirely normal from matters strictly relating to public spending, where other departmental ministers were making inquiries or requests of the Treasury, that it would be the Chief Secretary who would deal with those. So that's entirely as one might expect.
Would you agree that this letter indicates that certainly as at the autumn of 2020, the government's on notice that the question of compensation is something that's both urgent and long overdue?
Well, clearly that is the Paymaster General's view at that time. Again, she was the minister responsible for this particular subject. I wasn't in charge of the overall government at that point, so it's hard for me to speak to what the overall government's view was at that particular moment, because I was not responsible for it. She was the responsible minister, was closer to what was happening, and clearly that was her view at the time. But again, that was in advance of, I think, the inquiry having made any interim reports before the Paymaster General appointing Robert Francis to do his study. Yes. So none of that had happened at that point. But clearly, for someone who was involved in it, saw that that was the direction of travel. And indeed, was not wrong in the sense that since then, around £500 million of compensation payments have been paid through the financial support schemes.
Yes, I should just say the financial support schemes have never been characterised as compensation, just in terms of...
Yes, but they were the mechanism for delivering...
In terms of the interim payments
delivering
last year.
the interim payments. So those were the mechanism, as I understand it, that was used to deliver the interim compensation payments of £100,000.
So officials, on any view, within the Treasury would have been aware that the question of compensation was regarded by the minister most closely involved as long overdue and urgent in terms of being addressed. There's no suggestion here in Ms Mordaunt's letter that the question of compensation didn't need to be looked at, for example, until the inquiry reported. It's action now that she's talking about.
Well, that's what she said. I think slightly differently, I believe that in Parliament, later on, she did make a statement whilst in that role saying that the issue of compensation would be determined after the inquiry made its final recommendations. That's what she said in Parliament, my understanding is, in a statement later. So I think the second part of what you said is slightly different to what she then later said in Parliament.
Well, let's just look at some of the key dates then. We have these correspondence in July and September 2020. And although I'm picking matters up in 2020, Prime Minister, the question of compensation had been there'd been calls for compensation for decades, as reflected, I think, in some of your opening observations. And there'd been calls by parliamentarians, in particular, between 2017 and 2019 for compensation. But in terms of the government, 2020, we have Ms Mordaunt's letters. And then in March 2021, and it may be that this is what you're referring to, Prime Minister, the Paymaster General announced in Parliament that an independent reviewer would be asked to carry out a study looking at options for a framework on compensation, ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry. Was that what you had in mind when you referred to Ms Mordaunt's subsequent statements?
Yes, I believe it was at that time.
So March 2021, she commissions that. In May 2021, a couple of months later, the Secretary of State for Health, the then Secretary of State for Health, I should say, Mr Hancock, gave evidence to this inquiry saying that if the inquiry recommended compensation, the government will pay it. Again, I'm just trying to get the main dates before I come and ask you a couple of questions. March 2022, then, was the delivery by Sir Robert Francis of the Compensation Framework Study to the Cabinet Office. And then if we just pick matters up at the end of March 2022, for the purpose then of the questions I want to ask you, Lawrence, can we have on screen, please, RLIT 302052? Thank you. So we've got the date there, 31st of March 2022. And if we zoom in on the first answer from the Minister for the Cabinet Office, please, Lawrence. So Mr Ellis, who was by this time in post, says, Sir Robert Francis delivered his report to me on the 14th of March. I will carefully consider his findings and recommendations. It is my intention to publish the compensation framework study alongside the government's response as soon as possible and in sufficient time for the infected blood inquiry and its core participants to consider them before Sir Robert gives evidence to the inquiry, which was due to be, and in fact was, in July 2022. Now, you will know, Prime Minister, and I'm not going to ask you about the detail of this, we've explored it with other witnesses, but you will know that the government did not publish its response to the Francis study, either at that time or at any point subsequently. So that's the chronology. March 2022. There is then this inquiry's first interim report and a prompt decision made by government to accept the recommendation within 3 weeks of the interim payments. We then moved to December 2022, when Mr Quinn, the minister who was by that time responsible, accepted the moral case for compensation in Parliament. And we can look at it if need be, but I'm sure you're familiar with that from the reading that you've done for the purposes of your evidence. So he accepted the moral case but couldn't commit to a timetable. And then we have the second interim report of this inquiry in April. And then subsequent parliamentary statements have been to the effect that the government's still not made a decision on the question of compensation. Now that's the core chronology then, raised in the terms we've seen it by Ms Mordaunt in 2020. So over 3 years ago, the matter was identified by Ms Mordaunt as both urgent and long overdue. Over 16 months since Sir Robert Francis's compensation framework study was delivered to the government, and now over 3.5 months since the government's second interim report, recommending compensation on the basis of wrongs done at individual, collective and systemic levels. And the people whose lives were torn apart by those wrongs still have no idea of the shape the form, the scope of any compensation scheme, or of timescale. Now, against that background, that overarching chronology, and I'm going to invite, if you're able to, a yes or no answer to this question. Is that good enough in terms of the government's response?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, of course, people have been waiting far too long to get the recognition that they deserve for what's happened and the redress for what's happened. I was very clear about that at the outset of my remarks. Now, I can only speak to the government that I'm responsible for, which, as you highlighted at the beginning, has only been for the last 8 months or so. So many of the things earlier in that chronology, the government might have done, but I'm sure you'll take evidence from other people. Ultimately, that was not my responsibility at the time, so it's not something I was directly involved in or can answer to. What I can tell you is what's happened under my government whilst I've been Prime Minister. And since that's happened, days afterwards, interim payments were made to around 4,500 people, £100,000 each. In December, as you mentioned, that was a couple of months after I was Prime Minister, for the first time ever in decades, first time any government accepted the moral case for compensation. That was an important recommendation. I believe it was the first recommendation put in Robert Francis's study, and the Minister for the Cabinet Office accepted that on the floor of the House of Commons for the first time ever. And that happened whilst I was Prime Minister. And then subsequently to that, and in parallel, there's been an enormous amount of work that is happening across government, which, as the Minister responsible, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, I'm sure, explained when he was giving evidence earlier this week, to ensure that when the government receives the final report, as has been its position consistently, it will aim to act as quickly as possible to make decisions and provide people with the recognition of the justice that they deserve. As I said, the chronology stretches back long before I was Prime Minister, and but as I said, since I have been Prime Minister, these are the very specific steps that have been taken, which I think are meaningful, but I acknowledge, of course, there's more to do, and I'm determined to move as quickly as practically possible after the government receives the final report. But in parallel, an enormous amount of work is going on all the questions around compensation.
I'm going to press you for an answer to the question, Prime Minister. You were not, of course, the Prime Minister from 2020. And I'm not suggesting that if there was fault on the part of government, it's fault for which you have a personal responsibility. But you were one of the most senior members of the government, and you now lead the government. And I'm inviting your perspective, given what you now know, you may not have known it at the time, but given what you now know, over 3 years, and still no concrete compensation framework in sight and no information about that, what it might look like, is that good enough?
I think what I'd say is, of course, people want to see... All I'd say is, in order for the government to make decisions on compensation, it is rightly has asked an independent inquiry to conclude its work, to provide the advice to government and recommendations about what to do. Now, having not been at the time responsible for initiating this inquiry in 2018, 2017, when it was announced, and determining its terms of reference, it's hard for me to second guess the process that was envisaged at the time or what I would have done differently. But the government at the time, having decided to establish an independent inquiry to make recommendations on compensation, fully funding it, recognizing that this was a complex and sensitive issue that required independent and thorough investigation, as is happening, it's reasonable to allow that inquiry to conclude its work. Now, at the time, 2020, 2019, the inquiry had not concluded its work. Estimates had not been provided, questions around scope, eligibility, how best to do it, delivery mechanisms, none of those questions had been answered. Now, of course I appreciate that people want to see action as soon as humanly possible. I can entirely sympathize with that, right? And so sooner the better for sure, right? And of course, this has been going on for decades. Of course that's not good enough. But it's very hard for me to second guess the decisions that were made by people in good faith to establish an independent, thorough investigation of all these issues, provide advice to government on how best to deal with compensation and implement it, and then for government to act after receiving that advice. So in one sense, if the inquiry has taken this amount of time to provide that evidence, then saying to government, you should have acted before receiving the evidence, I think this is tricky. Because ultimately, people would then say, if they didn't like what the government had done, well, why haven't you waited for the result of your independent inquiry to come back and tell you its views on compensation? So if the government had just preemptively acted before the conclusion of this inquiry and reached a conclusion that people were unhappy with, I think most people would have said, well, you set up an independent inquiry. It's right that you should let that inquiry make recommendations to you before deciding what to do. So I think that is an entirely, that process I don't seem to think is unreasonable one. Now, would it be preferable for that process all to be able to happen faster than it has done? Of course it would be, because this has been going on for far too long. I acknowledged that at the beginning. This has been going on for decades. People have been waiting. But in terms of the process that I did not put in train, that is in train, and I think is reasonable, I think that is right that the inquiry finishes its work, provides those independent recommendations, which it has done and is doing, and then the government acts as quickly as possible to make decisions and bring the appropriate recognition and redress to people.
May I just ask, is your answer then to Councillor's question that you would have wished it had been quicker?
Well, I think no one, of course it would wish it would have been quicker, right? Yeah. I think that seems self-evident. This has been going on for decades. I don't think anyone would sit here and say that they wish that this process could not be concluded quickly, given what's happened over the successive decades. Everyone wants to see as swift resolution to this tragedy as possible, this appalling scandal be righted as quickly as possible, but also, as your work has uncovered over the past 5, 6 years, however long you have been investigating this, that there are a range of complicated things to work through, a range of sensitivities. It's important that that work is done thoroughly so that there's a full and proper understanding of the issues at stake and the appropriate way to provide that recognition and redress. And if it was a simple matter, then presumably no one would have thought an inquiry was the right thing to do, but people called for an inquiry. They called for an inquiry because they thought it was right that someone independently looked at all these issues, and they supported the work of the inquiry, and that work is happening. But as a general principle, would I prefer this all to be dealt with as quickly as possible? Of course, because this is an appalling scandal that has gone on for decades.
Ms Mordaunt, as her contemporaneous statements made clear, as well as her evidence to this inquiry, commissioned the compensation framework study precisely so that the government could have independent advice without waiting for the recommendations of the inquiry, albeit that the structure would then only be set up and the payments made once the inquiry had made its recommendations. But the whole point of Ms Mordaunt's actions in commissioning Sir Robert Francis' study was that everything could be done to ensure that on the conclusion of the inquiry, not weeks or months after, but on the conclusion of the inquiry, compensation could be payable if that was what the inquiry recommended. Now, over 16 months since Sir Robert reported to the Cabinet Office, those most affected by this still have no idea of the government's response. Is that good enough?
So what Penny Mordaunt said, I believe at the time of the statement, was that government would wait to receive the inquiry's final recommendations before making decisions on compensation. I believe that's what she said at the time that she announced the Robert Francis study. I believe she said that in the House of Commons from the dispatch box. I think that was her stated position. And again, because I was not responsible for this policy or for the government, and nor the Penny Mordaunt report to me, obviously I'm not privy to whatever decisions were made at that time as to what people's thinking in government was about this particular area. But I think she was clear that her expectation was Robert Francis's work would inform the work of the inquiry, but ultimately government would respond when the inquiry had concluded. And I think that's what she said pretty clearly at the time. But it is worth saying that government has acted since then in providing interim compensation payments which was the recommendation of the interim report. It was acted on swiftly in a matter of weeks, and then shortly after I became Prime Minister, those payments were made to 4,500 people.
What Ms Mordaunt said in Parliament was she was commissioning this work to look at options for a framework ready to implement, upon the conclusion of the inquiry. Now, leave aside what she meant by the conclusion of the inquiry, because she probably didn't envisage that the inquiry would make its recommendations on compensation before its final report. Does the government have options that are ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry?
The government, as you would have heard from the Minister for the Cabinet Office this week, is conducting an extensive amount of cross-government work to analyse all the various questions and recommendations posed in the interim reports, so that government is in a position to act as quickly as possible after receiving the final report. And that work continues at pace. Again, the minister responsible is the Minister of the Cabinet Office, and he would have explained in detail exactly what is happening over the past several months that he's had that job, but there is extensive work that is happening. There's a determination to move as quickly as possible, as I said, and at the appropriate time, that advice would be surfaced to me.
I will come back to the phrases as soon as possible or as quickly as possible and at pace, because they're phrases that the inquiry has heard a lot without having a clear idea of what's meant by that. But can I just repeat the question? Does the government have options that are ready, and I'm not asking you for detail of what they are because of the parameters of government decision making and so on, does it have options ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry?
As you acknowledged earlier, advice would not be brought to my attention until it was ready, because that work is ongoing and the policy work is complex. All the issues involved that have been highlighted in previous evidence require quite a lot of thought and consideration about how best to do them. Those decisions have not been made, but that policy work is ongoing so that the government is in a position to move quickly, but that work is clearly not concluded and no decisions have been made, and I am not intimately involved or familiar with it, as would be normal, because that would be surfaced to me at the appropriate time.
So is the answer to my question no, or is the answer to my question I don't know?
The answer to your question is I would not be in a position to go over the policy detail at this stage, because it would not have been, as is entirely normal, not been surfaced with me, because the policy development is ongoing.
Just if I may, Mr. Richards, I heard the answer not so much as no, but not yet. There may not be much of a difference. Can I just remind everyone, I know the evidence is emotive to many of you, but we do have a tradition of respecting the witness to make it easier for them to say what they want to say. Please.
Could we look at something you say in your witness statement, Prime Minister? WITN 7712001, paragraph 5, please, Lawrence. So if we go to the next page. You say this at the conclusion of your statement. You set out that the government is taking every step to prepare to respond appropriately to the inquiry's final report. Can I ask what the basis is for your statement to that effect? Is that an assurance you've been given, or is that your own assessment of the position?
Both, I'd say. There is an extensive amount of work ongoing in government on this issue, which the Minister for the Cabinet Office, as I said, would have outlined for everybody here, and as done previously, but he's had, I think, half a dozen different meetings with all of those involved across government, having met campaign groups as well, the APPG, having met those directly infected and affected, having engaged with ministers from the devolved administrations. So all of that work is ongoing, and there's a determination to move thoroughly through all the issues that need working through.
What we learnt from Mr Quinn's evidence is that meetings at permanent secretary level commenced on the 30th of November last year, that the small ministerial group that he asked to establish and was permitted to establish began its meetings in February of this year, that the meetings with devolved administrations took place in June, possibly also July of this year. Now that suggests that there has been work undertaken over the last few months, but doesn't really explain the position over the preceding 2.5 years. Are you able to cast any further light on why we really seem to see only activity over the last few months?
Well, I think you said you started seeing activity in November, and I became Prime Minister at the end of October. So again, I can talk to you in detail about the government that I'm responsible for, and as you say, I became Prime Minister on the 25th of October. That first set of meetings that you described happened in November, and there's been, I believe, half a dozen meetings since then at a ministerial level, which is almost one a month, which is a significant amount of activity for cross-ministerial work, I would say, in my experience, as well as further meetings with APPG chairs and those affected as well. So taken together, I think that is a significant body of work since I became Prime Minister, and that is what I can best speak to and am responsible for. Obviously, I'm not responsible for the preceding 2 to 3 years of how government organised its time. But I'm sure you all have and will take evidence from those who were at the time, and they can probably answer better to that than I can.
The government's position of waiting until it receives the final report is the next matter I wanted to ask you about, Prime Minister. So Mr Quinn told us in terms that is the government's position, to wait for this inquiry's final report before it responds to the question of compensation. Now, does the government acknowledge and accept that this inquiry's second interim report, so the report published on the 5th of April of this year, constitutes the Chair's complete recommendation on compensation? That is his final report on the question of what compensation should be payable and to whom. Does the government understand that?
Government does understand that, but as is entirely normal and precedented, government would wait for the conclusion of an inquiry's findings, so it has the full context and understanding of everything that is relevant to the situation before making final decisions. That's the long-standing convention and precedent and what advice we recommend following, and that is the process being undertaken here. Having said that, that doesn't mean that work doesn't begin beforehand, and as we've just been talking about, work has been ongoing for all the months that I've been Prime Minister at a more intensive pace than I think has happened at any point previous to that. So people should be reassured that just because the final report hasn't come does not mean that all the questions that have been raised in the interim report are being looked at, being examined, being analysed and being worked through, because there is the determination to try and move as quickly as practically possible, but it is entirely normal that government would wait for the full context of an inquiry's findings to be concluded.
That may be a perfectly ordinary process in many cases, but here, government has accepted already the moral case for compensation. It's accepted already that the making of some interim payments, and described by the then Prime Minister as, I think, the beginning, not the end. It said in terms through its then Secretary of State for Health, Mr Hancock, if the inquiry recommends compensation, the government will pay it. Why in those circumstances, and given everything you've recognised about the decades of suffering and the decades of being rebuffed, why wait further? What is it you think you will learn, and when I say you, I mean the government, will learn from the final report relevant to the question of compensation that you do not already know?
Because before making final decisions, there's the context in which those decisions need to be made. So understanding the full context of the inquiry's findings about what has happened over the preceding decades is important for a variety of policy reasons, as I understand it, that will have a bearing on various things. And that's why the government would ordinarily wait to have the final report, so it has a full set of findings to make decisions on. There's good legal precedent and reasons for that, and rational decision-making would suggest that is the right thing to do. But I would go back to saying that that doesn't stop the government from acting, and it has acted. The payment, I think, as you acknowledged, the payment of interim compensation payments to 4,500 people is a significant step. It was described as such by Robert Francis, and where I think he described those sums as, in his words, significant amounts, because he recognised at the time that it was likely that ultimate compensation would take time. I believe the first interim report from this inquiry also acknowledged very clearly that it was likely that the government would normally wait until receiving the final report before making decisions, and acknowledge that itself. So that was, as I said, a recommendation in the interim. This inquiry recognised that is what the likely, I think, scenario would be. So I don't think that's untoward, but the government is acting with interim compensation payments, and acting, as you said, to be the first government ever in decades to accept the moral case for compensation. Now, of course, that is only a step towards providing the recognition and redress that everyone here and everyone watching deserves, but it should give people some comfort about my and the government's determination to sort this out and address it, given we are taking steps that no other government has taken.
What are the sound policy reasons you referred to in your answer a few minutes ago for waiting for the final report in this context?
I think as the inquiry acknowledged in its note of the 21st, whilst ongoing policy making is happening, it is difficult for me to comment in detail on those things, and indeed that was something that the inquiry acknowledged in its note on the 21st of July, and indeed something the Minister of the Cabinet Office would have spoken to as well. As I said, in general terms I can talk about it, which is that it is important for rational decision-making purposes, legally if nothing else, to have the full findings of an inquiry before making decisions. That is absolutely precedented in normal advice, and understanding the full context of all the inquiry's findings before making final decisions on something as complex and sensitive as this.
And what, I may be repeating a question, but what is it that the government thinks it will know relevant to compensation that it doesn't already know?
Again, I know this will sound frustrating, but because there are active policies under consideration and legal considerations which ordinarily the government would not comment on, whilst those decisions are yet to be made, I can't go into those things in detail, but it is entirely normal and would be normally legally advised to the government not to make final decisions until an inquiry has finished. And there are a variety of things that the inquiry may or may not say in its final report that will impact the overall way that this appalling scandal is treated and dealt with, and it will put the previous findings in a broader context that is helpful for the government when it makes those final decisions.
One of the recommendations in the interim report, the second interim report of the inquiry, expressed, as you know, to be the final word on compensation, is that the compensation scheme should be set up now and should begin its work before the end of the year. I think that's recommendation 18 from memory. Does your evidence mean that the government has rejected recommendation 18?
The government is doing its work, and what I don't want to do is add to what I believe to be a litany of broken promises and dashed expectations that everyone in this room and everyone watching has had to endure for years, if not decades. So the last thing I want to do is sit here and promise something else and give people false hope, and I want to be completely straight. Right? I want to see resolution as quickly as practically possible. I've made that crystal clear. The actions of my government to date should give people some confidence and assurance that that is what we are working towards. But these are sensitive, complicated matters on a significant scale that require work to work through them properly. That work is happening, so it's hard for me to give a precise time frame on exactly when and how these things will be resolved. But an important step on that is receiving the final report, obviously.
Some fear that the reason, or a reason, why the government's position, and I don't think this is active ongoing policy making, it's been the government's position as I understand it for some time, unmovable, of waiting for the final report before it makes any decisions on compensation, is either an excuse for delay because the government only started the real work too late, or it's because at that point, the point of delivery of the final report, the inquiry will no longer have powers and the government will be free to ignore the recommendations of the inquiry with impunity. That's the fear, Mr. Sunak. I'm not putting that to you as a statement of fact, but that is people's concern. And the absence of a clear explanation as to why government is waiting for the final report when that wasn't what the second interim report anticipated is fueling that fear. Are there any observations you can make in relation to those matters?
Well, the reassurance I try and give people is to say, look how we've acted, to be the first government that accepted the moral case for compensation, to have made the interim compensation payments. Now that the MCO has given evidence, people can see a sense of the breadth and intensity of the work that is happening in government that, as far as I can tell, was not there in the past. So I think that should give people some reassurance that there's a desire to see this through. And in terms of things like this happening, I think it's entirely normal that inquiries would finish their work, make recommendations to the government, and then government would respond appropriately to them. That's what happens in every other case. That is exactly normal. And then it's a question of, well, how is government held to account? I think we're very lucky to live in a country where there is very strong parliamentary scrutiny. We have a very vibrant media, as the chair alluded to at the beginning. So there's lots of different ways that government is held to account, both in Parliament and in public opinion, for how it behaves, and is very transparent about all of those things. But I think it's entirely normal that inquiries finish their work, make recommendations, government will respond, and the combination of public opinion and Parliament rightly holds government to account, and we have very strong scrutiny accountability mechanisms to do that.
Do you accept that waiting for the final report inevitably means further delay, and depending on how long the government then takes to consider the report, may then lead into a period of a general election, of election purdah with all the policy-making constraints that imposes? And so this could simply prolong the question of compensation for a very substantial period of time indeed, which was certainly not, I think, what Ms Mordaunt anticipated.
I think, as the chair set out at some point when he was describing this inquiry's work, I think the chair said wanted to proceed as quickly as thoroughness allows. I think that is a good guide to how government should behave as well. And that's certainly my intention, is to proceed as quickly as thoroughness allows, as this inquiry's work is also doing. And that's the commitment that I would give people. And as I said, the track record since I've been Prime Minister has showed, I think, considerable forward progress, accepting that there is still lots to do.
Will you, Prime Minister, can I stress in asking this question, I'm not asking you to perform a volte-face on the government's position in the witness box. Okay, that would not be a correct question to put to you. But will you, Prime Minister, agree to the government looking again, to you and your colleagues, looking again at the question of whether you really should wait until the final report rather than take decisions and announce decisions now, given everything you've referred to about people suffering, about the period of time, about people dying whilst they're waiting? would you agree to go and look at that again? I'm not asking you to commit to any outcome, because that would have to be a matter then for collective decision-making within government. But is that something you can take back? Not least because if the principal reason for waiting for the final report is that that's what normally happens, that may not be a good enough reason.
I think it's right that government goes through this properly, given the complexity and scale of the scandal that has befallen us over many decades. And this inquiry's work has taken several years, rightly and necessarily. So I think that gives everyone a sense of the complexity and scale of what we're dealing with, that this inquiry's work has taken that long. And it was right that it takes that long, because there's a lot to go through, and these are important issues that require thorough examination. And I think it's equally right that government is thorough in how it then responds. Now, I don't want, as I said before, I don't want to add to the history of false promises, dashed hopes and expectations. The actions of the government to date speak to my desire to move this forward, and that remains my commitment. The actions demonstrate that, and the work is ongoing to enable us to do that, and it will continue to do so. Everyone in government, from me down, understands the urgency and importance of this issue, and I'm sure these hearings and your work have only reminded everybody of the importance and urgency of it, and I know that will be an important feature of the work going forward too.
Is the answer to my question that you're not able to give one, or that you're declining to...
No, I think, Mr. Richards, as you said, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to change government policy here at the dispatch box.
You're talking over each other. Could you let the Prime Minister finish his answer before we ask the next question?
Yeah. No, I was saying it wouldn't be appropriate for me to speculate on changing government policy here, as you acknowledged. As I said, I've given you an answer fulsome in my desire to see urgency around this issue, and I think these hearings have served to remind everybody working on this issue in government how important it is that we move with urgency, because of the appalling scandal that this was and the decades of injustice that have brought us to this point.
My question, Prime Minister, was not would you change the government's position in the witness box, but is there any willingness on the part of the government you lead to look again at the question of waiting for the final report?
Again, Ms. Richards, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to speculate on changing the government's position in public. That wouldn't ordinarily happen, as I think you acknowledged to me in your note on the 21st of July.
May I just ask a question? And I wonder if you can give this your personal consideration, not here, but in due course. It may be thought that waiting for an event, in this case, the publication of the final report, is a question of timing. That is, if it's going to happen then, we can wait till then. And that's when we will take action. It may be a question of principle, which is normally done, that there is a principle of some sort, which means that you need to look at a final report before you answer. But can I ask you just to consider this? I don't want to tempt Providence, but suppose something happened which meant that the inquiry report was inevitably delayed. Suppose, as I said, I would tempt Providence, but suppose some accident happened to me, or some illness which meant that I couldn't complete it for a further 3 months. Are people going to be expected to wait for that further 3 months before having a response from the government, given that they will have all that time until the autumn this year already passed in order to get ready to respond?
Well, I'd say, Chair, not wanting to speculate on your future
it's
health
for you to
circumstances,
take back and think about.
No, again, I'd just go back to what I said previously. Ultimately, it's in the inquiry's control when it concludes its inquiry and presents those final findings to government. And I think there's a determination amongst everyone's part to see that happen as quickly as possible. And I'm sure the inquiry will reflect on that as well. That's not what I'm in control of. But what I can control is the work that is ongoing now to make sure that all the things that need to be considered when it comes to compensation, which have been raised in the interim reports, are being looked at and examined, and that policy work is happening. But what I don't want to do, as I said, is put an artificial timeline on something that can't be met. And as I said previously, because I'm not intimately involved in the policy detail, as is entirely normal, as that is surfaced to me, then it will be a different story. But that work is ongoing.
In what was the most recent debate in the House on this issue, which was the 22nd of June 2023, Dame Diana Johnson, at the conclusion of the debate, said this: it seems to me that real political leadership to get this done is lacking. It's not good enough. Action is needed now. And we've seen, and I don't think it's necessary to put it on screen, but we've seen, for example, from the statement of Kit Malthouse, who was then Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, talking about needing to have senior ministerial assistants to push matters through. We've heard from Mr. Hunt, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, but when he gave evidence to this inquiry last year, about the importance of having the Prime Minister's direct involvement in something, and how once the Prime Minister says something can be done, it can be done. He was talking there in the context of the establishment of this inquiry. Ms. Mordaunt said towards the conclusion of her evidence on Monday that she believed this matter to be a priority for the Prime Minister, for you. We know from your statement and understand that it's not hitherto been something in which you've had direct involvement. Is it right to understand that this is now something that you regard as a priority?
Yes, of course. And that's why, as I said, that's why I'm here, and that's why, since the government that I lead was formed, you've seen, I would believe, tangible, concrete progress and action on this very important issue, more so than we've seen in the past, and that's what you will see going forward.
So I understand there are some technical problems with the document display, and I do need to, for the purpose of my next questions, show the Prime Minister some documents. Some documents he's already seen, but I do need to bring them up on screen. I don't know how long. Told 5 minutes or so.
Well, shall we have an afternoon break at this stage, or is that too early?
It's a matter for you, sir.
Well, I'm conscious that we don't want to detain the Prime Minister any longer than necessary.
No, but I'd say I've got not less than 20 minutes, probably half an hour. Very
well. Well, we'll take a short break. Shall we say, because everyone has to, let's take a quarter of an hour now, shall we? That gives us time to get everything sorted and have the Prime Minister back. Prime Minister, you maybe, this is your time, I think, to leave. As you heard me say at the beginning, everyone will remain in their seats while you exit this chamber. And we will see you back, please, at 3:20.
And the usual warning, sir.
Yes, you're giving evidence. You may not discuss the evidence you have given or anything which you think you may yet be asked in evidence with anyone, whoever that anyone is. See you back at 3:20.